Miller's Quality Meats, Detroit's East Side, November 14th, 1988, 11:47 at night. Frank Miller is wiping down the butcher block when he hears the bells above the front door jingle. He looks up, already knowing this isn't a customer. Nobody buys chuck roast at midnight in this neighborhood. 3 men push through the door. 2 have guns. The third carries a baseball bat wrapped in electrical tape. Frank recognizes the setup immediately, because this is the 7th time in 14 months that armed men have walked into his shop and demanded money he doesn't have. The one with the bat speaks first, telling Frank to open the register and move slow. Frank nods, his hands still wet from cleaning the cutting station. The shop smells like it always does at closing time. Sawdust and blood and the faint metallic tang of meat that's been hanging in the cooler since morning. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting everything in that flat, institutional glow that makes the white tile walls look like they belong in a morgue. Frank moves toward the register, but his eyes track to the wall above his workspace, where the tools of his trade hang on magnetic strips. Cleavers, boning knives, meat saws, each one sharp enough to split bone with a single stroke. He's been a butcher for 14 years, since he came back from Vietnam and decided he needed work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. He's good at it. He understands anatomy, weight distribution, how to break down a carcass efficiently. He knows exactly where to cut to separate muscle from bone, how much force different joints require, which tools work best for which tasks. The man with the bat steps closer, tells him to hurry up. Frank can smell crack cocaine on him, that chemical sweetness that means the man is high and unpredictable. The 2 with guns spread out, covering angles like they've done this before. One of them notices the walk-in freezer, makes a comment about taking some steaks too, maybe the whole beef tenderloin hanging inside, something about that casual entitlement, the idea that they'll steal not just his money but his product, his craft, the meat he cut and trimmed and priced, triggers something in Frank that 14 months of restraint and 7 previous robberies had compressed into a single point of explosive force. His hand moves toward the register but then changes direction, reaching up, fingers closing around the wooden handle of the 10-inch cleaver that he'd sharpened that morning. To understand what Frank Miller became that November night, you have to understand Detroit in 1988. This wasn't just a city in decline. This was America's industrial heart in full cardiac arrest, dying in real time while the rest of the country looked away. The auto plants that had employed 300,000 workers in 1970 were closing one after another. Unemployment sat at 18% officially, probably closer to 30% in neighborhoods like the East Side where Frank's shop operated. The crack epidemic had transformed entire blocks into open-air drug markets where 14-year-olds carried guns and life expectancy dropped by a decade. The police were overwhelmed to the point of irrelevance. Detroit recorded 686 homicides in 1988, making it the murder capital of America. Average response time for emergency calls exceeded 90 minutes in certain areas. Officers filed reports but rarely made arrests because the courts were so backlogged that prosecutors declined to charge anything except the most violent felonies. Property crime was essentially decriminalized through administrative neglect. If someone robbed your store, you filed a report that went into a filing cabinet that nobody would ever open again. Frank Miller's shop sat on Cheney Street, deep in the East Side, in what had been a thriving Polish neighborhood when he'd opened in 1974. Back then, the block had bakeries and shoe repair shops and families who'd lived there for 3 generations. The old women would come in speaking Polish, asking for specific cuts their grandmothers had taught them to cook. Frank learned their names, their recipes, their stories about coming to America and finding work in the factories that built tanks during World War II. By 1988, most of those families were gone. The ones who could afford to leave had moved to the suburbs. The ones who remained were elderly, poor, trapped in houses they couldn't sell in a neighborhood the city had abandoned. The bakery was boarded up. The shoe repair shop was now a blind pig, selling liquor without a license. Half the streetlights didn't work because the city couldn't afford to fix them. The police station that used to be 6 blocks away had been closed to consolidate resources. The nearest patrol car was now 25 minutes away on a good day, which meant if something happened, you were on your own. Frank had been robbed 6 times before that November night. The first time in April of 1987, 2 teenagers with a crowbar smashed his window at 3 a.m. and took $147 from the register. He called the police. They arrived 2 hours later, filed a report, told him to install better locks. He did. It didn't help. The second robbery came in July. This time they had a gun. They took $320 and his wedding ring, the gold band his wife Martha had given him in 1972, 2 years after he came home from Vietnam. The police filed another report. Frank Miller learned about death in Vietnam. He was drafted in 1968, 2 months after his 19th birthday, processed through Fort Knox, and shipped to the Mekong Delta by August. He spent 2 years as an infantry rifleman in Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, operating in the wetlands south of Saigon, where the Viet Cong controlled territory at night, and the Americans controlled nothing except the ground they were currently standing on. Frank saw combat 73 times, though the official record only listed 42 engagements because command didn't count firefights that lasted less than 15 minutes or involved fewer than 20 enemy combatants. He killed his first person in October of 1968 during a night ambush. A VC fighter, maybe 16 years old, came through the tree line carrying an AK-47. Frank shot him twice in the chest, from 15 feet away. The kid dropped. Frank walked over, looked down at what he'd done, and felt nothing. That absence of feeling scared him more than the violence itself. The sergeant told him it was normal, that you couldn't function in combat if you felt everything, that the human brain has mechanisms for compartmentalization that turn on when necessary. Frank discovered those mechanisms worked extremely well in him. By the time he rotated home in 1970, he'd killed 8 people that he knew of, probably more in firefights where you couldn't confirm who shot whom. He understood how to use violence efficiently, how to assess threats quickly, how to make decisions under pressure when hesitation meant death. He also understood the aftermath, the way you cleaned up after combat, the way you moved bodies, the way you lived with what you'd done by not thinking about it too much and never talking about it at all. Frank came back to Detroit in February of 1970. The city was different than when he'd left. The riots of 1967 had burned sections to the ground. White families were fleeing to the suburbs. The auto industry was starting its long contraction. But the East Side Polish neighborhood where Frank had grown up was still relatively intact, still functioning. and Frank needed something stable to hold on to because everything else in his head felt like it was sliding away. He met Martha in March of 1971 at a church social. She was a nurse at Detroit Receiving Hospital, steady and practical, and willing to love a combat veteran who didn't talk much about what he'd seen. They married in 72. Frank used his savings from Vietnam, combat pay, and hazard bonuses that he'd never spent because there was nowhere to spend money in the Delta to lease a small retail space on Cheney Street. He became a butcher because the work made sense to him. It required precision, knowledge of anatomy, careful use of sharp tools. It was physical labor that occupied his hands and gave him something to focus on besides the nightmares that still occasionally woke him at 3 a.m. The robbery started in April of 1987 and escalated methodically over 14 months. The first incident was almost pathetic in its execution. 2 teenagers, maybe 15 years old, high on something, threw a brick through Frank's front window at 3:17 in the morning. The alarm went off, but the monitoring company couldn't reach Detroit Police Dispatch for 45 minutes because the 911 system was overwhelmed. By the time officers arrived, the kids were gone. They'd taken $147 from the register and a dozen ribeye steaks from the display case. The window cost $800 to replace. Frank's insurance covered $500. He ate the difference. The second robbery came in July, 3 months later. This one was more professional. A man in his 20s with a 9mm pistol came in 20 minutes before closing time when Frank was alone. He ordered Frank to open the register and empty the safe. Frank complied because that's what you're supposed to do when someone has a gun pointed at your chest. The man took $320 and spotted the gold wedding band on Frank's left hand. He demanded it. Frank hesitated. The man pressed the gun against Frank's forehead. Frank removed the ring, the gold band Martha had given him in 72. The robber walked out. Frank called the police. They arrived 90 minutes later, took a report, told Frank that armed robbery was unfortunately common, and unless the perpetrator was caught in the act, recovery was unlikely. Robbery number 3 happened in September. 2 men, mid-20s, both armed, both wearing ski masks. They knew the layout of the shop, which meant they'd been watching him, planning. They took $415 in Frank's leather jacket, a vintage bomber jacket he'd bought in 76. They also destroyed his meat scale, smashing it with a baseball bat for reasons Frank never understood. Maybe they were high. Maybe they just enjoyed destruction. The police report went into the same filing cabinet as the previous 2. No arrests were made. The 4th robbery, in November of 87, involved a gun put directly against Frank's head while he was told that if he ever called the police again, they'd come back and kill him. They took $600 and 2 boxes of frozen steaks. Frank didn't call the police that time. He told Martha what happened. She begged him to close the shop, move somewhere safer. Frank refused because moving meant surrendering everything he'd built, letting Detroit's collapse consume his life's work, admitting that survival in this city was impossible for ordinary people who played by rules nobody else followed. Robbery 5 came in March of 88, Robbery 6 in August. Each incident followed the same pattern. Armed men walked in, threatened violence, took money Frank couldn't afford to lose. The police response became progressively less engaged. By the sixth robbery, the responding officer didn't even pretend to investigate. He told Frank outright that unless someone died, there wasn't enough manpower to pursue property crimes. Frank asked what he was supposed to do. The officer suggested installing cameras, hiring security, maybe closing earlier. Frank pointed out that cameras just recorded robberies happening. Security cost more than his profit margin allowed. And closing earlier just meant getting robbed during daylight hours instead. November 14th, 1988. 11:47 at night. Frank Miller is alone in his shop, performing the closing routine he's executed thousands of times. Wipe down the butcher block with hot water and bleach. Cover the display case. Lock the walk-in freezer. Count the register, though there's rarely much to count anymore because customers pay with food stamps or don't come at all. The shop is quiet except for the industrial refrigeration units humming in the back room and the occasional car passing outside on Cheney Street, bass vibrating through windows with no glass in them. When the bells above the door jingle, Frank's hands stop moving. He knows immediately this isn't right. The front door was locked. He'd turned the deadbolt 5 minutes ago, but 3 men pushed through anyway, which means they either picked the lock or kicked it hard enough to break the frame. They spread out with practiced efficiency, 2 flanking the entry while the third advances toward the counter where Frank stands. 2 have guns, 9mm pistols, held loosely like they've carried them before. The third has a baseball bat wrapped in electrical tape, the kind of improvised weapon you use when firearms aren't available or you want something quieter. Frank recognizes the dynamic instantly because 14 months and 6 previous robberies have taught him exactly how these encounters develop. The one with the bat is the talker, the one who manages the victim, while the gunman provides threat escalation if compliance isn't immediate. The talker tells Frank to open the register and move slow, keep his hands where everyone can see them, don't do anything stupid. Frank nods. His body language shows submission, hands visible, shoulders slightly hunched. The posture of someone who understands violence is present and wants to avoid it. But Frank's mind is calculating differently now. He's processing angles, distances, weapon placement. The nearest gunman is 12 feet away, too far to close effectively. The second is near the door, 15 feet, watching the street outside in case police happen to pass. The one with the bat is 8 feet away, close enough to matter. Frank's eyes track to the wall above his workspace where the cleaver hangs on a magnetic strip. The 10-inch Victorinox with the forged carbon steel blade that he'd sharpened that morning until it could split a hair. The man with the bat steps close, tells Frank to hurry up. Frank can smell crack cocaine on him, that chemical sweetness that permeates sweat when someone's high. The smell triggers something primal in Frank's threat assessment because drugs mean unpredictability, impaired judgment, capacity for extreme violence without rational motivation. The second gunman notices the walk-in freezer, calls out that they should take meat too, maybe grab some steaks, the whole beef tenderloin hanging inside. His partner laughs, says they'll need a truck for all that. Something about that casual entitlement breaks something inside Frank that 14 months of restraint had been compressing. They're not just robbing him anymore. They're mocking him. treating his life's work like it's theirs to take, meat he'd butchered and trimmed and priced. Inventory representing hours of labor and decades of skill. His right hand moves toward the register, but then changes direction, reaching up smoothly, fingers closing around the wooden handle of the cleaver. The weight feels perfect in his grip, balanced, familiar, an extension of his arm. The man with the bat realizes what's happening 1 second too late, his eyes widening as Frank's arm comes down. The cleaver connects with the bat wielder's left forearm as he's raising it, defensively. The blade cuts through the ulna bone with the same ease Frank uses to joint a pork shoulder. That familiar resistance followed by separation. The man screams, a high-pitched sound that doesn't match his size, and drops the bat. Blood sprays across the white tile wall in an arterial pattern that Frank recognizes from thousands of butchering sessions. The injured man stumbles backward, clutching his arm, and that's when the first gunshot goes off. The sound is deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hits the meat display case behind Frank, shattering glass and embedding itself in a tray of ground chuck. Frank doesn't freeze. Vietnam taught him that hesitation in close quarters kills you faster than bad decisions. He moves toward the shooter, closing the 12-foot gap before the man can aim properly for a second shot. Frank swings the cleaver in a horizontal arc. The shooter tries to dodge, but his back hits the cooler door. The blade catches him across the shoulder and upper chest. Not a clean cut like the first strike, more of a diagonal slash that opens jacket and flesh simultaneously. The shooter fires again, panicked, and this bullet goes through the front window, spiderwebbing the glass. He's screaming now, trying to bring the gun around for a point-blank shot, but Frank is already inside his reach. Frank drops the cleaver and grabs the man's gun hand with both of his own, using body weight and leverage to slam the shooter backward into the commercial meat grinder station. The grinder is an industrial Hobart model that Frank uses to process trim and make fresh ground beef. The shooter's head hits the metal housing hard enough that Frank hears the skull crack. That distinctive sound, like stepping on a walnut. The third man, the one who'd been watching the door, runs. He makes it 3 steps before Frank catches him by the collar and yanks backward. The man's feet go out from under him, and he hits the floor hard. Frank is on him instantly, 63 years old, but still carrying the reflexes and muscle memory from Vietnam. He grabs the fallen cleaver, and the third man's eyes go wide, with the understanding that he's about to die in a butcher shop on Detroit's east side, killed by someone who knows exactly how to use the tools of his trade. Frank brings the cleaver down. The man tries to block with his hands. The blade goes through his right palm completely, then continues into his chest cavity. Frank pulls the cleaver free and strikes again, this time at the neck, severing the carotid artery. Blood pumps out in rhythmic spurts that match the dying man's heartbeat. Frank steps back, breathing hard, and surveys what he's done. 3 bodies. The first man is still alive, making gurgling sounds, trying to crawl toward the door, while leaving a blood trail on the tile floor. The second is unconscious or dead against the meat grinder, blood pooling beneath him. The third is definitely dead, lying in an expanding circle of red that's already soaking into the sawdust. Frank spreads on the floor, to absorb moisture during butchering. The whole encounter took 30 seconds, maybe 40. Frank looks down at himself. His apron is soaked with blood. His hands are trembling slightly, adrenaline flooding his system. The shop smells like copper and fear and the emptied bowels of men who died violently. Frank Miller stands in his butcher shop at 11:52 at night, surrounded by 3 bodies and the wreckage of violence, and faces the most important decision of his life: call the police and accept whatever legal consequences follow, or handle this himself. His training from Vietnam provides clinical clarity. First priority is stopping the bleeding on the one who's still alive. The man with the severed forearm has maybe 5 minutes before he passes out from blood loss, 10 before he dies. Frank could apply a tourniquet, call 911, claim self-defense. The evidence supports that narrative. 3 armed men broke into his shop. He defended himself. Any reasonable prosecutor would decline charges, but Frank knows Detroit's legal system in 1988 isn't reasonable. He knows that self-defense cases can take years to resolve, that legal fees would bankrupt him, that prosecutors facing political pressure to reduce violence might decide to make an example of a white shopkeeper who killed 3 black men, regardless of circumstances. He knows the dead men's families might sue civilly, that even if he wins criminally, he could lose everything in wrongful death litigation. And he knows that the police who couldn't protect him from 7 robberies probably won't protect him from retaliation by associates of the men he just killed. Frank walks over to the man with the severed arm. The man's eyes are glazed, shock setting in, but he's still conscious. Frank kneels down, looks directly into his eyes, and asks if he has anything to say. The man tries to speak, but only manages a wet, coughing sound. Frank nods, stands up, and goes to the tool rack. He selects a boning knife, the 6-inch Forstner with the flexible blade he uses for detailed work. He returns to the injured man and cuts his throat quickly, professionally, the way you'd bleed out a deer. The man spasms once and goes still. Now Frank has 3 bodies and approximately 6 hours before his assistant arrives at 6 in the morning to begin prep work for the day's opening. 6 hours to clean a crime scene that covers 200 square feet of tile floor, to dispose of 3 corpses, to remove all physical evidence that violence occurred here. Frank's first thought is to call the police anyway, to do the right thing legally and morally. But then he looks around his shop at the business he built from nothing, at the 14 years of 6-day work weeks, and learning his customers' names and cutting meat with precision, because quality matters even when nobody's watching. He thinks about Martha, about the mortgage on their house in Hamtramck, about retirement savings that don't exist because every spare dollar went back into the shop. He makes his decision. He's a butcher. He has the tools, the knowledge, the equipment. He has a commercial meat grinder that can process a whole beef carcass. He has industrial-grade cleaning supplies. He has refrigeration capacity. He has disposal relationships with rendering companies that pick up organic waste twice weekly and never question quantities, because butchers generate waste, and that's just how the business works. He has, in other words, everything necessary to make 3 bodies disappear completely. Frank locks the front door, flips the sign to closed, and pulls down the security gate. He goes to the back room and retrieves his heavy rubber apron, the one he uses when breaking down primals, and puts it over his blood-soaked regular apron. He pulls on elbow-length rubber gloves. He drags the first body into the back room where the equipment is, then returns for the second, then the third. By 12:30, all three are laid out on the stainless steel tables Frank uses for butchering. Frank Miller approaches the disposal problem with the same systematic professionalism he brings to breaking down a side of beef. He's done this work for 14 years, processing thousands of animals, understanding anatomy, weight distribution, which tools work best for which cuts. The human body he knows from Vietnam and from basic biology isn't fundamentally different from a large mammal in terms of structure. Skeleton, muscle groups, connective tissue, organs. The mechanics of disassembly are identical. What's different is the psychological dimension, the knowledge that these were people hours ago, that they had names and lives and people who will wonder where they went. Frank shuts down that thinking immediately. Compartmentalization, the skill he learned in the Mekong Delta, kicks in. These aren't people anymore. They're problems to solve, weight to manage, evidence to eliminate. He starts with the first body, the one whose throat he cut. He uses the boning knife to open the abdominal cavity, the way you'd field dress a deer. Internal organs come out first. They go into heavy-duty contractor bags, the kind rated for construction debris. Organs are mostly water, difficult to process mechanically, but they'll break down quickly in the industrial waste stream. Next comes the skeletal structure. Frank uses a hacksaw for the larger bones, the femur and humerus, cutting through at the joints where possible to minimize effort. Where joints won't separate easily, he uses a cleaver to break through bone. It's loud work. The cleaver hitting bone makes a sound that carries, so Frank turns on the radio, classic rock station, volume up to mask the noise. The Rolling Stones play while Frank reduces a human skeleton to manageable pieces. Ribs come off with tin snips. The spine requires the hacksaw and considerable effort. Skulls are problematic, dense bone, but Frank has a commercial-grade bone saw designed for cutting through beef shanks. It works adequately for this purpose. The muscle tissue is easiest. Frank strips it methodically, separating it from bone the way he'd debone a chicken, just larger scale. The meat goes into the industrial grinder, the Hobart model that can process 80 pounds of beef per hour. Frank feeds it slowly, mixing human tissue with beef trim from the cooler so the grinder doesn't jam. The mixture that comes out looks like regular ground meat, reddish-brown, homogeneous. It goes into contractor bags that Frank will label as waste trim destined for rendering. By 3 a.m, the first body is processed. Frank has 4 large contractor bags of organic material, mostly ground tissue and organ meat, and several bags of bone fragments. The bones are the challenging part. They're identifiable as human if anyone examines them closely. Frank's solution is the industrial meat smoker he uses occasionally for specialty products. He fires it up to maximum temperature, 600 degrees, and incinerates the bone fragments over the next 2 hours. What remains is ash and small calcified pieces that could be anything. He'll mix those with regular ash from the smoker and dispose of them with normal refuse. Bodies 2 and 3 follow the same process. By 5:30 in the morning, all 3 are reduced to anonymous biological material contained in contractor bags. Frank has generated approximately 30 bags total, including the organic waste, bone ash, and contaminated sawdust He's swept up from the shop floor. The tile floor itself requires intensive cleaning. Frank uses industrial degreaser first, then bleach solution, then hot water. He scrubs on his hands and knees for 90 minutes, removing every trace of blood from grout lines and corners. The 3 men Frank Miller killed on November 14, 1988, have names. Marcus Webb, 24 years old, resident of Detroit's Lower East Side, arrested 6 times for assault, drug possession, and armed robbery. Convicted once, served 11 months in county jail. Darius Collins, 23, Marcus's cousin. Similar arrest record, known associate of a crack distribution network operating out of the Brewster Douglas housing projects. Jerome Taylor, 26, the oldest, the one with the baseball bat. 3 prior convictions, including aggravated assault and weapons charges, currently on parole that he reports to twice monthly when he remembers. All 3 men disappear on November 14th. None of them comes home that night. Their associates notice by the next afternoon because they were supposed to deliver money from the robbery to their supplier. When they don't show up and don't answer their pagers, people start asking questions. Calls are made. Nobody's seen them. Nobody knows where they went. The last confirmed sighting is Marcus telling his girlfriend they were going to hit a butcher shop on Chain A Street. Easy money. The old white guy who runs it never fights back. She remembers the address because Marcus made her write it down in case something went wrong. By November 16th, 72 hours after the disappearance, Marcus Webb's mother files a missing persons report with Detroit police. She goes to the precinct station on Gratiot Avenue, waits 3 hours to speak with an officer, fills out a form with Marcus's description and last known location. The officer taking the report asks routine questions. Does Marcus have a history of drug use? Yes. Has he disappeared before? Yes, several times. Usually when he's high or hiding from someone. Could he have left Detroit voluntarily? Possibly. The officer files the report in a cabinet containing approximately 800 other active missing persons cases. He tells Marcus's mother that unless evidence of foul play emerges, the department's resources don't allow for active investigation of adults who disappear voluntarily. Darius Collins's family files a similar report on November 17th. Jerome Taylor's parole officer files one on November 20th when Jerome misses his scheduled check-in. All 3 reports go into the same cabinet. None receives investigative follow-up because Detroit police in 1988 is operating at roughly 60% of the staffing level needed to handle the city's crime volume. The detective unit assigned to missing persons has 4 officers covering a city of 1 million people. They prioritize cases involving children, elderly persons with dementia, or missing persons where evidence suggests immediate danger. 3 young men with criminal records who disappear after discussing a robbery don't meet priority criteria. Detective Raymond Pierce does conduct minimal follow-up on the Webb case because the mother is persistent, calling daily, showing up at the precinct, demanding action. Pierce reviews the missing persons report, notes that Marcus told his girlfriend about planning to rob a butcher shop on Chain Street. He drives to the east side, finds Miller's Quality Meats, walks in on November 23rd at 2 in the afternoon. Frank Miller is behind the counter, cutting pork chops for an elderly Polish woman who's explaining how her grandmother made them in the old country. Pierce waits until the customer leaves, then introduces himself, shows his badge, asks if Frank experienced any problems recently. Robberies, suspicious persons, anything unusual. Frank looks directly at Pierce and says, "No. Everything's been quiet lately. Business as usual." Pierce asks if Frank's heard about 3 men missing from the neighborhood. Frank says no, but he doesn't pay much attention to neighborhood gossip. Pierce thanks him for his time, hands him a business card, says to call if he remembers anything relevant. Frank takes the card, says he will, and Pierce leaves. The criminal network that Marcus Webb, Darius Collins, and Jerome Taylor operated within notices their disappearance quickly because money is missing. The 3 were supposed to deliver $600 to their cocaine supplier by November 15th, payment for a previous shipment fronted on credit. When they don't show and don't answer pages, the supplier, a mid-level dealer named Curtis, who runs operations from a house on Mack Avenue, assumes they're either arrested or ripping him off. He sends associates to their last known locations. Nobody's seen them. Their cars are still parked where they left them. Their girlfriends claim ignorance. Curtis escalates to threats, telling anyone who'll listen that if those 3 are hiding, they're dead when he finds them. But weeks pass, and nobody finds them. No arrest records appear. No bodies turn up in vacant lots or the Detroit River. No hospital admissions match their descriptions. They've simply vanished. By December, the story starts circulating through the network of street-level dealers, thieves, and associated criminals who operate in the East Side neighborhoods. 3 guys went to rob a butcher shop. They never came back. Nobody knows what happened. The speculation begins. Maybe they got arrested under false names. Maybe they ran with the money. Maybe they're in Chicago or Atlanta, hiding from Curtis. Maybe they're dead. Then someone remembers that Marcus told his girlfriend which shop they were hitting. Miller's Quality Meats. The name circulates. People who know the area mention that Frank Miller is the owner. White guy, older, keeps to himself. Former military, supposedly. Someone claims Frank has mob connections, that the shop is a front for organized crime, that robbing it was suicidal. Someone else says Frank is ex-CIA, trained in interrogation and disposal. The theories proliferate because the truth, that Frank simply killed them and processed their bodies like beef carcasses, is too disturbing to consider seriously. By January of 1989, Miller's Quality Meats has acquired a reputation. Street criminals avoid it. When younger guys talk about easy targets for robbery, someone always mentions the butcher shop and says, "No, don't go there. Remember what happened to Marcus and them." The story grows in the telling. Some versions claim Frank killed them execution style. Others say he tortured them for information. A few whisper that he fed their bodies to customers, ground them into hamburger, sold them as Sunday roast. That last version is too grotesque to believe, but it persists anyway because urban legends fill the space where facts don't exist. Frank Miller notices the change, but doesn't understand it initially. Robbery attempts stop. He goes weeks, then months, without incident. His shop, which was targeted 7 times in 14 months, suddenly becomes safe. Other businesses on Chain Street still get robbed. The liquor store 2 blocks down gets hit 3 times in January alone. The party store across the street gets cleaned out in February. But nobody touches Miller's Quality Meats. Frank assumes he's just lucky, that the robbery cycle has moved to different neighborhoods. What he doesn't know is that his name circulates in conversations among criminals as someone dangerous, someone connected, someone you don't target unless you want to disappear. The rumor mill has transformed Frank Miller from a 63-year-old butcher into a mythological figure, Detroit's version of a mob enforcer, a man who makes problems vanish without trace. The reality that Frank is just a Vietnam veteran who killed in self-defense and covered it up is less interesting than the legend. So the legend spreads, and Frank benefits from a reputation he didn't cultivate and doesn't know he has. His shop becomes an island of safety in a neighborhood where safety is usually purchased through gang affiliation or protection money. Frank pays nothing and threatens nobody. He just cuts meat and goes home to Martha every night, carrying secrets that grow heavier with each passing week. February 12th, 1989, 10:30 at night. Frank Miller is closing the shop 3 months after the November incident when 2 teenagers push through the front door. They're young, maybe 17 or 18, wearing oversized jackets and moving with the jerky energy of people high on crack cocaine. The taller one has a kitchen knife, not even a proper weapon, just a serrated blade, probably taken from his mother's drawer. The shorter one is unarmed, but keeps his hand in his jacket pocket like maybe he has something there. They haven't heard the stories about Miller's quality meats, or they've heard them and dismissed them as neighborhood mythology, the kind of urban legends that circulate in Detroit about various supposedly dangerous people who turn out to be ordinary when you actually confront them. The tall one tells Frank to open the register. His voice cracks mid-sentence. Teenage vocal cords, not quite settled into adult register. Frank recognizes immediately that these kids are amateurs, desperate, probably need money for their next hit. The smart thing would be to give them the $83 in the register and let them leave. That's what the old Frank would have done, the Frank who existed before November 14th. But something fundamental changed that night. Frank discovered he's willing to kill to protect what's his, and more disturbingly, that he's capable of doing it efficiently without much emotional aftermath. The compartmentalization he learned in Vietnam, dormant for 18 years, has reactivated. He feels it now, that cold assessment of threat and available response options. Frank's hand moves to the register, but his eyes track to the meat cleaver on the magnetic strip. The motion is subtle enough that the teenagers don't notice immediately. Frank pops the register drawer, and in that moment of distraction when both kids look at the money, Frank grabs the cleaver and moves. He covers the 8 feet between the counter and the tall kid in less than 2 seconds. The cleaver comes down in a diagonal strike that catches the kid across the upper chest and shoulder. The blade cuts through his jacket, through his collarbone, deep enough that Frank feels bone separate. The kid makes a sound between a scream and a gasp and drops the kitchen knife. The shorter kid runs. He makes it to the door, gets it open, is halfway through when Frank catches him. Frank grabs the back of his jacket and yanks him backward with enough force that the kid's feet leave the ground. They both go down. Frank lands on top, cleaver still in his right hand. The kid is trying to scream, but Frank's weight on his chest prevents full inhalation. Frank brings the cleaver down. The kid gets his hands up in defense. The blade cuts through his left hand at the wrist, severs it completely, continues into his throat. Blood sprays up into Frank's face, hot and copper-smelling, coating his glasses so he can barely see. Frank stands, breathing hard, and looks at what he's done. 2 more bodies. The tall kid is still alive, making gurgling sounds, trying to crawl toward the display case. Frank walks over, kneels down, and finishes him with the cleaver through the back of the neck, severing the spinal cord. The motion is clinical, precise, the same technique you'd use to kill a chicken. Both kids are dead within 90 seconds of entering the shop. Frank estimates they were 16 or 17 years old. Kids, really? Someone's sons? Maybe someone's brothers? It doesn't matter now. They chose to rob his shop. They chose violence. Frank simply responded with superior violence, faster and more decisive. The cleanup takes 6 hours. Frank follows the same procedure as November. Bodies go to the back room. Disassembly happens on the stainless steel tables. The meat grinder processes tissue. The smoker incinerates bone. By 5 in the morning, 2 more people have been reduced to contractor bags of organic waste. Frank mops the floor, scrubs the grout, uses enough bleach that the shop smells like a swimming pool. When his assistant arrives at 6, Frank tells him the bleach smell is from deep cleaning the walk-in freezer. The assistant doesn't question it. Why would he? Frank's been running this shop for 15 years. He knows what he's doing. Between February and August of 1989, Frank Miller kills 7 more people. Not because he wants to, not because he's become some kind of serial killer who hunts for pleasure, but because robbery attempts continue, and Frank has decided that compliance is no longer his default response. Each incident follows a similar pattern. Someone enters the shop with a weapon and demands money. Frank assesses the threat. If the person seems genuinely dangerous, if they have a gun, or multiple attackers are involved, Frank reaches for the cleaver first and the register second. If the threat seems minimal, a single unarmed person or someone clearly hesitant, Frank sometimes just gives them the money and lets them leave. But anything in between, anything that triggers his threat assessment as potentially lethal, he responds with immediate violence. Robbery number 9 happens in March. A man in his 30s with a .38 revolver. Frank kills him with the cleaver before he can fire. Robbery number 10 comes in April. 2 men with knives. Frank kills one immediately, the other runs, but Frank catches him in the back alley. Robbery number 11 is in May. A woman strung out on drugs with a broken bottle. Frank hesitates because she's female, which nearly gets him stabbed. He reacts instinctively, cleaver through her ribs. She dies on the floor next to the meat display case. Robberies 12 and 13 happen within the same week in June. Both are solo attackers. Both die within seconds of threatening Frank. Each killing gets easier psychologically. The first 3 in November bothered Frank for weeks afterward. He had nightmares. Woke up at 3 in the morning seeing their faces. The February killings, the 2 teenagers, those haunted him because they were so young, barely old enough to vote. But by March, the emotional impact diminishes. Frank discovers he can kill someone, process their body, clean his shop, and go home to Martha without significant psychological distress. It's not that he enjoys it, he doesn't. But he's adapted to it the way soldiers adapt to combat, the way butchers adapt to killing animals, the way humans adapt to anything when survival depends on adaptation. The disposal method becomes routine. Frank schedules robbery attempts for nights when his assistant is off. He's not consciously creating opportunities, but he's also not avoiding them. Monday and Thursday nights he works alone. Those become the nights when criminals attempt robbery, whether because they've noticed the pattern or just through random chance. Frank keeps the cleaver sharp. He maintains the meat grinder meticulously. The commercial smoker runs almost constantly now, incinerating bone fragments. His disposal of organic waste increases noticeably. The rendering company picks up 3 times weekly instead of twice. They don't question the volume increase. Business fluctuates. Sometimes butchers have more waste. That's normal. What Frank doesn't fully recognize is that he's created a feedback loop. Criminals attempt robbery, Frank kills them. The survivors spread stories that Frank is dangerous but unstoppable. This attracts a certain type of criminal, the ones who hear warnings and interpret them as challenges, who think they're smarter or faster than whoever came before. It also attracts the desperate ones, the crack addicts, who need money so badly they'll try anything regardless of risk. These people keep coming to Miller's Quality Meats, and Frank keeps killing them. And the pile of bodies processed through his meat grinder grows. Throughout the spring and summer of 1989. By August, Frank has killed 11 people total. He keeps count in a small notebook hidden in his bedroom. Just dates and brief descriptions. November 14th, 3 men, armed robbery. February 12th, 2 teenagers, knife. March 8th, 1 man, gun. April 3rd, 2 men, knives. The list continues. Frank tells himself he's documenting evidence in case he's ever caught, that the notebook proves self-defense. But really he's keeping score, maintaining a record of his survival, counting the people who tried to take what was his and failed. 11 people. 11 times Frank chose violence over compliance. 11 times the system that was supposed to protect him didn't. So he protected himself with the tools of his trade and the skills he learned in Vietnam, and hoped nobody ever connected the disappearances to the butcher shop on Cheney Street. By summer of 1989, residents of Detroit's East Side have noticed something unusual about Miller's Quality Meats. The shop sits in the middle of a high-crime corridor where robbery, assault, and drug dealing are so common that police don't even respond to most calls anymore. The liquor store 2 blocks east gets robbed monthly. The party store across the street has been hit 8 times in the past year. The check cashing place on the corner employs armed security and still gets robbed. But Miller's Quality Meats, which used to be targeted constantly, hasn't had a visible robbery attempt in months. The front window is intact. The door isn't broken. Frank Miller arrives every morning at 5 and leaves every evening at 10, regular as clockwork, alone, vulnerable, apparently untouched by the violence surrounding him. The neighborhood develops theories. Mrs. Kowalski, who's lived on Cheney Street for 47 years and buys her pork chops from Frank every Saturday, tells her daughter that Frank must have paid protection money. Some gang must be watching his shop. That's the only explanation for why criminals leave him alone. Her daughter points out that Frank doesn't have the kind of money gangs demand for protection. Mrs. Kowalski insists something's keeping the criminals away. Maybe Frank has connections nobody knows about. Maybe he's related to someone important in the mob. Detroit's Italian mob is mostly defunct by 1989, but the perception persists that organized crime still controls certain businesses. Other theories circulate. Marcus Washington, who operates a barbershop 3 doors down from Frank's shop, tells customers that Frank's definitely armed. Must have a gun behind the counter, maybe multiple guns, maybe even an alarm system connected directly to police dispatch. That's why nobody robs him anymore. Word got out that he's protected, that trying to rob him means getting shot or arrested. Marcus's customers debate this theory. Some agree it makes sense. Others point out that police don't protect anyone in this neighborhood, that alarm systems just mean police file a report after you're already dead. Something else is keeping criminals away from Miller's quality meats. The truth that 11 people have attempted robbery and all 11 have disappeared, processed through Frank's meat grinder and disposed of as organic waste, is too dark for anyone to seriously consider. Human psychology resists conclusions that require believing your neighbor is a serial killer, even when evidence points that direction. It's easier to believe Frank paid protection money, or has a gun, or got lucky. The alternative, that a 64-year-old butcher has killed nearly a dozen people and dismembered their bodies using commercial meat processing equipment, sounds like something from a horror movie, not real life in Detroit. But some people in the criminal community understand what's happening, at least partially. Curtis, the cocaine dealer who lost 3 associates in November, has quietly spread the word that Miller's quality meats is off limits. He doesn't know exactly what happened to Marcus, Darius, and Jerome, but he knows they went to that shop and never came back. He knows others have disappeared after targeting the same location. Curtis isn't stupid. He recognizes a pattern. Something about that butcher shop kills people. Whether it's Frank Miller himself or something else doesn't matter. The result is the same. Go there with bad intentions and you don't come back. This creates a paradox. Miller's quality meats becomes one of the safest locations in the East Side. Regular customers shopping for meat are completely safe because Frank only kills people who threaten him. Mrs. Kowalski buys her pork chops every Saturday without incident. The elderly Polish women who've been Frank's customers since 1974 continue their weekly visits, discussing recipes and grandchildren while Frank cuts their orders with the same knives he uses to dismember bodies on Thursday nights. The shop's legitimate business actually improves because customers notice they're never hassled by criminals when visiting Frank's place. They can park on the street without worrying about car theft. They can walk to the shop after dark without fear of robbery. Frank Miller has created an island of safety through systematic murder, and nobody except the criminals themselves understands why. Frank Miller doesn't feel remorse exactly. Remorse implies regret, a wish that things had happened differently. Frank doesn't regret killing the 11 people who tried to rob him. Each one chose to enter his shop with violent intent. Each one got exactly what their actions warranted. This is how Frank rationalizes it when he's lying awake at 3 a.m, listening to Martha breathe beside him, thinking about the bodies he's processed. They came to hurt him, possibly kill him. He responded with superior force. That's not murder, that's survival. But Frank also recognizes something has changed inside him, something fundamental about how he relates to violence and death. Before November 14th, 1988, Frank hadn't killed anyone since Vietnam. 18 years of civilian life, of cutting meat and serving customers and living quietly. He'd successfully buried the combat veteran part of himself, locked away the person who could kill efficiently, and sleep fine afterward. Then 3 armed men walked into his shop and that lock broke. The combat veteran emerged. The person who understands violence as a tool, who can dismember bodies without emotional breakdown, who processes death as a technical problem rather than a moral crisis. Frank finds himself thinking about killing with the same clinical detachment he brings to butchering. When someone enters the shop, Frank automatically assesses threat level. Could he reach the cleaver before they reach him? Is the person armed? Are there escape routes? How would he dispose of the body? These thoughts happen automatically now, background processing that runs constantly. Frank has become hypervigilant in ways that remind him of Vietnam, when every sound might be incoming fire, when relaxation meant death. He thought he'd left that mindset in the Mekong Delta. Apparently it was just dormant, waiting for circumstances to reactivate it. The meat grinder bothers him more than the killing itself. Frank can rationalize killing in self-defense. He can tell himself that anyone who threatens him with a weapon has forfeited their right to sympathy. But putting human bodies through the grinder, watching them reduced to ground meat, mixing human tissue with beef trim so the machine doesn't jam, that requires a level of desensitization that Frank recognizes as abnormal. Normal people can't do that. Normal people would vomit, break down, refuse. Frank does it routinely now. He's processed 11 bodies. He's gotten efficient. He can fully disassemble and dispose of a human corpse in under 4 hours, slightly longer than a full side of beef, but not by much. Sometimes Frank wonders if he's become a monster. Not legally, because every killing was legitimate self-defense, but spiritually, psychologically, in whatever dimension measures a person's humanity. He's taken 11 lives. He's ground their bodies into hamburger. He's incinerated their bones and thrown the ashes in the dumpster. He's erased them from existence so thoroughly that their families don't even have bodies to bury. That's monstrous behavior by any reasonable definition. Yet Frank doesn't feel monstrous, he feels practical. He solved a problem using available resources. The problem was people trying to kill him. The resources were his butchering skills and equipment. The solution was permanent removal of the threat. Martha doesn't know. Frank has hidden everything from her, not because he's ashamed, but because knowledge would make her complicit. If police ever investigate, Martha can honestly say she knew nothing. Frank protects her through ignorance, but the secrets create distance. He can't talk about his day without editing constantly. He can't explain why he insists on working alone certain nights. He can't share the stress he's carrying. Martha notices something's wrong. She asks if he's okay, if business is struggling, if he's having health problems. Frank says everything's fine, he's just tired, getting old, nothing to worry about. She doesn't believe him, but doesn't push, because their marriage has always respected boundaries. The nightmares return occasionally. Not every night like after Vietnam, just once or twice weekly. Frank dreams about the meat grinder, about feeding it bodies that keep regenerating, about grinding forever, while blood floods the shop floor faster than he can clean it. He dreams about faces, the people he's killed, their expressions in that final moment when they understand they're going to die. The two teenagers especially haunt him because they were so young, kids really, who made stupid choices driven by drug addiction and desperation. Frank tells himself they would have killed him if he'd hesitated. Maybe that's true. Maybe he just wanted to believe it was true, so he could live with what he did. August 19th, 1989, 9:45 at night. Frank Miller is counting the register when a man stumbles through the door, clearly high on crack cocaine, waving a .38 revolver that wobbles in his unsteady grip. The man is maybe 30 years old, emaciated, skin pulled tight over skull, eyes wild with chemical paranoia. He tells Frank to open the safe, give him all the money. Do it now. His words slur together. The gun waves in random directions, sometimes pointing at Frank, sometimes at the ceiling, sometimes at the floor. Frank recognizes immediately that this man is more danger to himself than to anyone else. The gun might not even be loaded. The man might not even know how to fire it properly. Frank could probably just hand over the register money and avoid violence. This isn't a professional criminal. This is an addict having a crisis, desperate for his next hit, barely functional. The old Frank, the one who existed before November 14th, would have given him the $86 in the register and let him leave. But the new Frank, the one who's killed 10 people in 9 months, sees this differently. Every addict who successfully robs him tells other addicts the shop is an easy target. Every time Frank complies, he invites the next robbery. The only way to stop the cycle is to make the cost of robbing him exceed any possible benefit. Frank reaches for the cleaver. The motion is smooth, practiced, muscle memory from 11 previous killings. The addict sees the movement, but his drug-impaired reaction time is too slow. He tries to aim the gun, but Frank is already moving, closing the distance, swinging the cleaver in a horizontal arc that connects with the man's gun hand. The blade severs 3 fingers. The gun falls. The man screams, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain. Frank brings the cleaver down again, this time at the neck, severing the carotid artery. The man collapses. Blood pumps out in weakening spurts. He's dead within 90 seconds. Frank drags the body to the back room, familiar routine now, efficient disposal methodology refined over 10 previous incidents. He's halfway through the disassembly process when he hears the front doorbells jingle. Someone else has entered the shop. Frank freezes, listening. Footsteps, hesitant, moving through the retail space. A voice calls out, asking if anyone's there. Female voice. Frank moves to the doorway, separating the back room from the shop floor, still holding the boning knife he was using to separate tissue from bone. A woman stands near the counter, mid-20s, thin, with the same haunted look that crack addiction creates. She's holding a kitchen knife, cheap serrated blade, shaking visibly. She asks again if anyone's there. Frank steps into view. The woman startles, nearly drops the knife, then regains her grip and points it toward Frank. She says she needs money. She's sorry. She doesn't want to hurt anyone, but she needs money right now. Her eyes keep darting to the door, checking her escape route. Frank recognizes she's terrified, that she's probably never robbed anyone before, that desperation has pushed her to something she's fundamentally unsuited for. For the first time since November, Frank hesitates. Something about her obvious fear, her apologies, the way she holds the knife like she doesn't really know how to use it, triggers something in Frank that 10 months of killing has suppressed. She's a threat, yes, but a minimal one. She's also someone's daughter, maybe someone's mother, a person whose life has collapsed into addiction, but who might still be salvageable if given a chance. Frank considers just giving her money and letting her go. He considers calling the police, having her arrested, getting her into the system where maybe she could receive treatment, but then she steps toward the register, and Frank's training overrides his momentary compassion. She made a choice. She entered his shop with a weapon. Intention matters less than action. Frank moves forward. The woman sees him coming, lunges with the knife in a clumsy stabbing motion. Frank blocks her arm and brings the boning knife up under her ribs, angled toward her heart, the way you'd stick a pig. She makes a gasping sound and goes limp. Frank holds her as she dies, feeling her weight sag against him, feeling her final breaths shake her body. He lowers her to the floor and looks at what he's done. 11 people, 11 human beings that Frank Miller has killed and reduced to organic waste. The woman stares up at him with eyes that are still open, still reflecting the fluorescent lights, fading from consciousness into death. Frank kneels beside her, reaches out and closes her eyes. It's the first time he's performed that gesture for any of his victims. He's not sure why he does it for her specifically. Maybe because she apologized. Maybe because her fear reminded him that most people aren't natural killers, that violence is learned behavior, that circumstances create monsters more often than genetics. Or maybe because Frank recognizes in her terror his own transformation, the way ordinary people become capable of extraordinary horror when survival demands it. September 26th, 1989. A health inspector from Detroit's Department of Public Health arrives at Miller's Quality Meats for a routine inspection that happens every 18 months, checking refrigeration temperatures, examining sanitation practices, reviewing disposal records. The inspector, a middle-aged woman named Carol Henderson, who's been doing this job for 12 years, goes through her checklist methodically. She checks the walk-in freezer temperature, inspects the meat display case, examines Frank's cutting surfaces for cross-contamination. Everything passes. Frank maintains his shop fastidiously. The cleanliness is genuine, not cosmetic, because Frank understands that working with meat requires absolute sanitation standards. Then Carol reaches the section of her inspection dealing with waste disposal. She reviews Frank's records for organic waste pickup, comparing the weight of material disposed against his retail sales volume. The rendering company that picks up Frank's waste provides monthly documentation showing how many pounds of organic material they've collected. Carol pulls out her calculator and runs the numbers. According to Frank's sales records, he should be generating approximately 400 pounds of waste per week, mostly fat trim, bone, and organ meat that customers don't want. But the rendering company's records show he's been disposing of closer to 700 pounds per week. Since February, Carol asks Frank about the discrepancy. Frank explains that he's been buying more whole animals lately, breaking them down himself instead of buying pre-cut primals. That generates more waste. Carol asks for documentation of those purchases. Frank provides invoices from his meat supplier showing increased purchases of whole beef and pork. The numbers seem to support his explanation. Carol makes a note but doesn't pursue it further. The discrepancy isn't egregious enough to suggest anything illegal. Butchers sometimes have legitimate reasons for increased waste generation. But Carol mentions the discrepancy to her supervisor when she returns to the office. The supervisor, dealing with budget cuts and staff reductions, files it away as low priority. 3 weeks later, during a staff meeting about department efficiency, someone mentions that several butcher shops have been flagged for waste disposal irregularities. The supervisor remembers Miller's Quality Meats. He pulls the file, reviews it, and notices that the waste increase started in February and has continued consistently. He decides to request a follow-up inspection, scheduled for November. Meanwhile, a completely separate investigation is developing. Darren Mitchell, a reporter for the Detroit Free Press, has been working on a story about missing persons in Detroit. The city has one of the highest missing persons rates in America, with hundreds of people disappearing annually and very few cases receiving serious investigation. Darren's angle is examining whether police resource allocation contributes to the problem, whether certain demographics of missing persons receive less attention than others. He's been reviewing missing persons reports filed in 1988 and 89, looking for patterns. What Darren notices is a cluster of disappearances in the East Side, specifically within a 6-block radius of Cheney Street, between November of 88 and August of 89. 11 people have been reported missing from that area. All 11 are young to middle-aged men and women. All have some criminal history. All disappeared without trace. No bodies found, no arrests made, no sightings after their disappearances. Individually, these cases aren't remarkable. Detroit's criminal population is transient. People get killed, run from debts, hide from warrants, or simply leave town. But 11 people from the same small area in less than a year seems statistically unusual. Darren maps the disappearances. He marks each missing person's last known location on a street map of the East Side. The pattern becomes visible immediately. 10 of the 11 were last seen within 3 blocks of Miller's Quality Meats. Darren doesn't jump to conclusions. Correlation isn't causation. Maybe that area is just particularly dangerous. Maybe a gang is operating there and disposing of bodies. Maybe it's random clustering that looks like a pattern but isn't. Still, it's worth investigating. Darren starts making calls, talking to families of the missing persons, asking about their last known activities. Marcus Webb's mother tells Darren that Marcus mentioned robbing a butcher shop the night he disappeared. She remembers because she begged him not to, told him robbery would land him in jail or get him killed. Marcus laughed, said it was easy money. Some old white guy who never fights back. That's the last time she saw him. Darren asks which butcher shop. She doesn't know the name, but it was on Chain Street. Darren checks his map. Miller's Quality Meats is on Cheney Street. He calls other families, asks similar questions. 3 more families mention their missing relatives, talked about robbing stores in that neighborhood. None can confirm which specific store, but the pattern is forming. By October 15th, Darren has enough information to contact Detroit police. He speaks with Detective Raymond Pierce, who handled the Marcus Webb missing persons case. Darren explains his research, shows Pierce the map with 11 disappearances clustered around Miller's Quality Meats. Pierce remembers visiting Frank Miller back in November of 88, asking about Marcus Webb. Frank said he hadn't seen anything. Pierce believed him. Now, looking at Darren's map, Pierce starts to wonder if Frank Miller's shop is somehow connected to these disappearances. Not necessarily that Frank is responsible, but maybe his shop is a landmark where criminals meet, or a territory line between gangs, or something that explains the clustering. Pierce decides to visit Miller's Quality Meats again, this time with more pointed questions. He arrives on October 23rd at 3 in the afternoon. Frank is behind the counter, cutting T-bone steaks for a customer. Pierce waits until the customer leaves, then approaches Frank, shows his badge again, reminds Frank they spoke last November about Marcus Webb. Frank nods, says he remembers. Pierce explains that he's investigating multiple missing persons cases, all from this neighborhood, all possibly connected. He asks Frank directly if he's noticed anything unusual over the past year. Strangers hanging around, confrontations, anything that might explain why so many people disappeared near his shop. Frank looks directly at Detective Pierce and says, no, he hasn't noticed anything unusual. Business has been quiet lately. Fewer problems than previous years. Everything's been normal. November 7th, 1989. Frank Miller wakes at 4 in the morning from a nightmare about the meat grinder. In the dream, he's processing bodies, but they keep regenerating, growing back faster than he can grind them, until the shop is filled with corpses and blood rises to his knees. He lies in bed, listening to Martha breathe, and realizes he's been waiting for this moment for 11 months. Waiting for the knock on the door, the arrest, the exposure. The walls have been closing in since the health inspector noticed his waste disposal discrepancy. Since the reporter started asking questions. Since Detective Pierce visited again with suspicion in his eyes. Frank gets out of bed quietly, goes to the kitchen, makes coffee. He sits at the table watching dawn break over Detroit, thinking about the 11 people he's killed. He remembers each one clearly. The 3 on November 14th, who started everything. The 2 teenagers in February. The others throughout spring and summer. The woman who apologized before she tried to rob him, whose eyes he closed after she died. 11 people who came to his shop intending violence and received violence in return. Frank tells himself again that each killing was justified, that self-defense is a fundamental right, that society's failure to protect him forced him to protect himself. But Frank also knows the law doesn't work that way. Self-defense requires proportional response, immediate threat, no reasonable alternatives. Frank can claim self-defense for the actual killings, but what he did afterward, the dismemberment, the disposal, the cover-up, that transforms justified homicide into 11 counts of first-degree murder. The legal system won't care that Frank was protecting himself. They'll care that he processed human bodies through a meat grinder and lied to police. They'll care that he continued killing instead of reporting the first incident. They'll care that 11 families have been denied closure because Frank cremated their relatives and threw the ashes in a dumpster. Martha comes into the kitchen at 6, sees Frank sitting with his untouched coffee, asks if he's okay. Frank looks at his wife of 17 years, the woman who stood beside him through Vietnam nightmares and business struggles and the slow collapse of Detroit around them. He considers telling her everything. Instead, he says he's fine, just couldn't sleep, worrying about business. Martha kisses his forehead and starts making breakfast. Frank watches her move around the kitchen and decides that today, November 7th, will be the day he stops running from consequences. He'll go to his shop, open as usual, and wait for whatever comes. At 9:30 that morning, Detective Raymond Pierce arrives at Miller's Quality Meats, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a warrant to search the premises. They've been investigating based on the reporter's research and the health inspector's notes. The warrant covers the entire shop, all equipment, all disposal records, all refrigeration units. Pierce approaches Frank, who's behind the counter as usual, and explains they need to conduct a search. Frank nods, steps back, doesn't resist or object. Pierce finds this response unusual. Innocent people usually protest searches, ask what this is about, demand to see warrants. Frank just stands quietly while officers begin examining his shop. They start in the back room, where Frank does his butchering and disposal work. Officers photograph the equipment, the meat grinder, the industrial smoker, the stainless steel tables. They swab surfaces for DNA evidence. They examine the drain systems looking for biological material. One officer opens the smoker and finds ash residue. He bags samples for laboratory analysis. Another officer checks the meat grinder, notices it's been cleaned recently, but finds tissue fragments in the mechanism. Those get bagged too. Detective Pierce walks through the shop slowly, observing, trying to understand what happened here. After 90 minutes of searching, Pierce approaches Frank and asks directly if he can explain the waste disposal discrepancies. Frank says he's been buying more whole animals. Pierce asks if he can explain why 11 people disappeared from this neighborhood after last being seen near this shop. Frank is silent for maybe 30 seconds. Then he says yes, he can explain that. Pierce waits. Frank takes a deep breath and says he killed them, all 11. Self-defense in every case. They came to rob him. He defended himself. Then he disposed of the bodies using his equipment because he didn't trust the legal system to recognize his actions as justified. Pierce stares at Frank, trying to determine if this is a confession or some kind of breakdown. He reads Frank his Miranda rights, slowly, making sure Frank understands. Frank says he understands and doesn't want a lawyer. He wants to explain what happened. Pierce sets up a recording device, identifies everyone present, confirms Frank is waiving his right to counsel. Then Frank talks. He describes November 14th, 1988. The 3 armed men, the cleaver, the decision to cover it up. He describes the subsequent robberies, each killing, each disposal. He provides dates when he remembers them. He explains his methodology, the meat grinder, the smoker, the rendering company pickup. Pierce listens without interrupting. The confession takes 43 minutes. When Frank finishes, Pierce asks if he feels any remorse. Frank considers the question carefully. He says he regrets that circumstances forced him to kill. He regrets that Detroit collapsed to the point where citizens have to defend themselves because police can't. He regrets that 11 people made choices that led to their deaths. But does he regret defending himself? No. Does he regret surviving when they didn't? No. Every person he killed chose to threaten him with violence. He simply responded with superior violence. That's not murder. That's survival. Pierce arrests Frank Miller for 11 counts of first-degree murder. Officers handcuff him, search him, place him in a patrol car. As they drive away from Miller's Quality Meats, Frank looks back at his shop, the business he built from nothing, the place that became both his livelihood and his killing ground. He knows he'll never see it again, except maybe in photographs during trial. The shop that was supposed to be his American dream became the location where he killed 11 people and learned that the line between butcher and murderer is thinner than most people want to believe. Frank Miller's trial began in April of 1990, 6 months after his arrest. The prosecution charged him with 11 counts of first-degree murder, arguing that the systematic nature of the killings, the cover-up, and the continued pattern demonstrated premeditation and depraved indifference to human life. The defense argued diminished capacity, extreme circumstance, and reasonable fear for life. They presented Frank's history, 7 previous robberies before the killings began, police reports documenting those incidents, testimony about Detroit's collapsed law enforcement infrastructure. They argued that Frank was an ordinary citizen pushed beyond reasonable limits by a society that abandoned him. The trial lasted 8 weeks. Forensic evidence was limited because Frank had been extraordinarily thorough in his disposal methods. The prosecution couldn't produce bodies, couldn't definitively prove the bone, ash, and tissue samples came from the missing persons, rather than from animals Frank butchered legitimately. Their case relied primarily on Frank's confession and the statistical improbability that 11 people disappeared near his shop coincidentally. The defense hammered on self-defense, producing evidence that every victim had criminal records, that several were armed when they entered Frank's shop, that Detroit's police response times made self-help necessary for survival. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They found Frank Miller guilty of 11 counts of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The distinction mattered legally because it acknowledged that Frank acted in response to genuine threat, even if his methods were excessive. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison, acknowledging the unusual circumstances but emphasizing that no matter how justified the initial killings might have been, the cover-up and continued pattern demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Frank was 65 years old at sentencing. 25 years meant he'd die in prison unless he received parole. Martha divorced him 9 months into his incarceration, not because she stopped loving him, but because the shame of being married to someone the media called the Butcher of Detroit became unbearable. She moved to Arizona, changed her name, tried to build a new life separate from the horror her husband created. Frank understood. He signed the divorce papers without contest. He'd destroyed enough lives. Destroying Martha's any further would have been unconscionable. Frank served 17 years of his sentence at Michigan's Thumb Correctional Facility. Prison was easier than he expected, not because the conditions were comfortable, but because Frank had lived through Vietnam and run a business in 1980s Detroit. Prison was just another survival situation requiring vigilance and adaptation. He kept his head down, avoided gang affiliation, worked in the prison kitchen, where his butchering skills made him valuable. Other inmates knew his story. Some respected him for defending himself. Others thought he was a monster. Frank didn't particularly care either way. He understood what he was, both monster and survivor, and accepted that duality without needing external validation. He was released in 2007, age 82, on medical parole after developing heart problems that prison healthcare couldn't adequately manage. He moved to a small town in northern Michigan, far from Detroit, far from Cheene Street, Far from everything that happened, he lives quietly now, under his own name because he's never tried to hide. He shops at local stores, receives occasional visitors from distant family members, spends his time reading and watching television. People in his town know who he is. An article in the local newspaper when he moved in explained his history. Most neighbors avoid him. A few are friendly, in that cautious way people are with someone dangerous but currently harmless. The case became shorthand for Detroit's collapse in the late 1980s. Academics studying urban decay reference the Butcher of Detroit as an example of what happens when social infrastructure fails completely, when ordinary citizens lose faith in institutions designed to protect them. Criminologists debate whether Frank's actions were justified self-defense or cold-blooded murder. Ethicists argue about where the line between reasonable force and excessive violence lies. The debate continues 20 years after the trial because the case touches fundamental questions about justice, survival, and what society owes its citizens. Miller's Quality Meats closed immediately after Frank's arrest. The building sat empty for 8 years before being demolished in 1998. A parking lot occupies the space now, unmarked, anonymous, giving no indication that 11 people died there and were processed through commercial meat equipment. The elderly Polish women who remembered when the East Side was thriving have mostly died or moved away. The neighborhood continues its decline. Cheney Street looks like a war zone now. Blocks of burned houses and vacant lots, the kind of urban prairie that forms when cities contract and nobody has money, or will, to rebuild. Frank Miller occasionally gives interviews, careful ones, vetted by his parole officer. He talks about Detroit in the 80s, about feeling abandoned by a system that took his taxes but couldn't protect his business. He talks about the fear that came with being robbed 7 times in 14 months, the understanding that police couldn't or wouldn't help, the realization that survival meant taking extreme measures. He doesn't apologize for killing 11 people. He apologizes for living in a country where killing 11 people seemed like the rational choice for a small business owner trying to survive. The families of his victims feel differently. They argue that Frank murdered their sons, daughters, brothers, sisters. They argue that whatever threat those people posed, they didn't deserve to be ground into hamburger and incinerated like garbage. They argue that Frank could have given robbers money and avoided killing, that property isn't worth human lives, that Frank chose violence when alternatives existed. Several families sued Frank civilly. Those cases were settled for minimal amounts because Frank had no assets. The judgments are symbolic, legal recognition that what Frank did caused harm regardless of his justifications. Frank Miller will die soon. He's 89 years old now in 2025 with advanced heart disease and the kind of general system failure that comes from being nearly 90. He'll die in his small house in northern Michigan, probably alone, certainly without fanfare. When he dies, the story of the Butcher of Detroit will fade from living memory into historical record, one more dark footnote in Detroit's long decline, one more example of what happens when the social contract breaks down so completely that ordinary people become capable of extraordinary violence because survival demands it, and nobody in power cares enough to intervene until bodies pile up and the damage is irreversible.